keynote speaker here this evening. He was born and reared in Jamaica and subsequently in Britain, where he received a Bachelor's of Arts at the University of Leeds and a Master's and doctorate degrees at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He currently resides in New York, where he is a teacher of history at Columbia University. He's written a number of publications and essays and articles that include Inside Babylon, the Caribbean Diaspora in Britain. He's co-author of The Poverty Brokers, the IMF in Latin America. He's currently completing Claude McKay, you know, If I Shall Die, The Making of a Black Bolshevik, which is scheduled to be released in 1999. And certainly we are honored to have his new book, and there's some copies on sale in the back. It is called Holding Aloft the Banner of Ethiopia, Caribbean Radicalism in the Early 20th Century America. Let us rise. It certainly is his first time here, but will not be his last. And welcome our keynote speaker this evening, Dr. Professor Winston James. Let us give a united African movement welcome to Dr. Professor Winston James. One more time for Dr. Professor Winston James.
Well, thank you very much. I'll have to come back again. I've never had a welcome like that before. Yeah, so I appreciate it very much. And I've been here since about 7:30, so I saw virtually all that has gone on. And I have been very moved by the experience of being here in your midst. Can you hear me? And a bit louder. Okay. I've been moved by the experience of being here. It's good to see black people together. In fact, quite often you don't see them together at all, never mind together doing something. So I'm delighted to see you here tonight doing something and doing good. So I'm privileged to be here and very pleased for the opportunity to speak to you tonight. Now, I had in fact prepared a talk on Harlem's political culture in Harlem's radical political culture in Marcus Garvey's time. But it is obvious that you are interested in Marcus Garvey's legacy and Marcus Garvey's work. So I'll concentrate on that tonight. In fact, I spent my time at the back trying to jot down some thoughts, gathering from the atmosphere some of the things that you might be interested in hearing about. My cup has been knocked over, so I'll drink from my other thing, but I don't mind if you don't. Let me first of all put a little slide, not a slide, a transparency that I want to show you. I hope it works okay. Oh, in front of me. Okay. Okay. That some of you will be familiar with. It's a photograph of the opening of the 19th, 20th convention of the Universal Negro Peoples of the World Convention. Universal Negro Convention. In fact, it was called Negro Peoples of the World Convention. Of course, it was organized by the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and it took place at Madison Square Garden in 1920. It was a remarkable event, and I think what it actually says is very important. It actually shows you large numbers of people, black people, looking on as the convention parade actually organized itself and moved to the meeting place. The slogan is also very interesting because it actually tells us that black people at that time, and certainly those involved in the Universal Negro Improvement Association, were not afraid. They call themselves new Negroes as opposed to old Negroes. And the slogan was, of course, the new Negro has no fear. Anyway, I thought I'd show you that, and it might be important to take some courage from that in the New York City in which we live today. So you can make your interpretation of that. One of the things I was moved by here this evening, yeah, you can switch it off really. You can switch on your stuff now. One of the things that I found moving was the way in which this meeting tried to make connections to the past, tried to make connections to the ancestors, tried to make connections in particular to those who have struggled on our behalf in the past. And I think that's very, very important for us as a people to develop a capacity to remember. It's important to remember. If you haven't got a memory, it's actually difficult for you to organize and survive as a people. If you haven't got a memory, you simply become individuals and individualists. You live for yourself as opposed to a wider group, and you have no sense of a connection with groups of people who have actually struggled on your behalf in the past. A. Philip Randolph, in an interview that was done in about 1970, he was a very old man at the time, he says that one of the problems, it was an interview that was done, I think, by Ebony magazine, he said, one of the problems that I have with the young black radicals is that they do not understand their history, they do not know their history. And I think that's a very, very important point, especially among the younger people in our community. It is important for us to understand our history. If we understand our history, we will have a greater respect for ourselves as well as for those who have actually suffered and have made achievement during that historical experience of black people, especially in the diaspora. The problem, however, is how do we keep our memories alive? Might seem a very simple question, but in fact the answer is quite complicated. The fact is that to remember, you have to plan to remember. If you're going to a shop, for instance, and you want to get a list of things, you actually write them down and take them with you to the shop. If you have an extremely good memory, then you might be able to just simply go in there and reel them off. But one of the most secure ways of guaranteeing that you do that you actually bring back what you went out in the first place for, is to write it down. And therefore, to actually retain our memory, our collective memory, it's important that these things are written down and passed on from one generation to the next. In order to do that, we need to build institutions, or at least we have to have access to institutions. And so it's important that we develop libraries. We actually publish books so that these memories, the things that we want to value, to cherish, and pass on from one generation to the next, we make sure that they're secure. Of course, what is clear about that is that to make that memory secure, you need resources. You need resources for libraries, you need resources for books, you need resources in terms of taping, videoing, whatever it is, whichever form you choose to actually record these things and establish institutional framework. And so it means that the people who are poorest are less likely to hang on to their memories. And rich people and powerful people hang on to their memories far more securely than ordinary people. And that's why we know far more about kings and queens, dukes, duchesses, and so on, and about those who were exploited and oppressed. They didn't have the resources to actually record and secure their own historical experience. So it's important to remember, and because of the lack of resources or limited resources of our people, it means that we have to make a special effort to remember. We have to remember to remember. Now, what I want to talk about then is the memory of Marcus Garvey, what we've managed to record, what we've managed to secure for posterity, and what his life, his contribution, and his struggles actually teach us. Garvey was born in 1887, as you all know, in St. Anne's Bay in Jamaica. 1887, that was the year. What was the world like in which Garvey entered? Well, there was only one, nominally at least, independent state in Africa. That was Ethiopia. There was Sierra Leone and Liberia, but both of those states didn't really enjoy full independence. The British had the final shot in Sierra Leone, and the Americans held sway in Liberia. It was better, at least in general, than out-and-out brutal colonialism, direct colonialism. But nevertheless, it wasn't a state of full independence. The entire map of Africa, from Egypt in the north, right down to the Cape, was dominated by Europeans, with the exception of that little state in the corner of Africa, in the Horn of Africa, called Ethiopia. Abyssinia, many people called it at the time. That was the state of the African continent. 2 years before Garvey was born, in 1885, The Europeans had just finished a conference in Berlin, the notorious Berlin Conference that went on between 1884 and 1885. And what you had among the major European powers in Berlin at the time was a sitting round a table by these European ruling classes, and basically looking at the map of Africa and dividing it up into nice little squares, oblivious to ethnic boundaries, linguistic groups, historical traditions, and so on. They didn't care about that. They could actually make straight lines, not looking at the way in which the ethnic groups were actually shaped and so on. And so they sat down and divided it up. The Belgians took this, the Dutch had that, not the Dutch, the Portuguese had that, the French had this, the British, of course, had most of it. That was what happened 2 years before Garvey was born. In the Caribbean in which he was born, in Jamaica in which he was born, Africans were nominally free. They had, so the book said, been given their freedom, emancipation in 1838. Some say 1834. But, in fact, between 1834 and 1838, there was what was called the Apprenticeship Period. What was the Apprenticeship Period? Well, the Apprenticeship Period, in essence, required Africans to work for their former masters for 40.5 hours a week without pay. If they worked beyond 40.5 hours, then they would be paid. And, of course, they had no way of controlling how much they would be paid. So the stipendiary magistrates, who were overwhelmingly white and biased in favor of the planters who were supposed to superintend the process of apprenticeship, quite often, made decisions in favor of the master class. The vast majority of people, certainly in the British Caribbean and the French Caribbean, were of African descent. Indeed, most of them were what they call Negroes at the time, the overwhelming majority. That is to say, people who were said to be of unmixed African blood, dark-skinned people. There's a significant difference between the way in which things operated in the Caribbean and the British and French Caribbean, also in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, to the way in which it operated here in the United States. Because what we had in those territories was a three-layer, a tiered society, with whites at the top. In the middle, you had the browns, and then at the bottom, you had the Africans, the dark ones. The Africans were not only exploited far more than anybody else, more oppressed than everybody else in relation to access to land, to the professions, to a whole number of resources, to education and so on. They were also looked down upon as inferior vis-a-vis the brown ones, the so-called mulattoes, and of course the white ones. The brown ones were inferior to the white ones, but the black ones were inferior to all of them. Garvey, as we all know, was an African, a pure African, as he would like to say. He was dark. He was born into a relatively poor family. His father was a stonemason. His mother was essentially a housewife, but she produced cakes and foods and made all sorts of things that she sold in order to supplement the family's income. Garvey's father apparently had access to land at an earlier stage in his life, but by the time Garvey was growing up, that land had been taken from him. So you had a situation wherein there was tremendous hardship in that family. Garvey had an uncle, however, who had some land, and he worked with his uncle. and spent much time with his uncle, but at the same time maintained contact with his immediate family. His father was an interesting man, however, in the sense that he was very much interested in self-improvement. He liked reading books. He operated as a sort of village lawyer. People had problems, they would come to him and talk to him about the problems, and he would try and resolve those problems. He was a proud black man in that environment, despite the fact that all these circumstances militated against black people having pride. There were black people who had some property, but these were a tiny minority in terms of the wealthy in that society. So what we had then in places like Jamaica, in the rest of the British Caribbean, in the French Caribbean, there are slight differences in the Spanish Caribbean, but the pattern remains fundamentally the same, is a situation where black people were clearly dominated by everybody else within that particular social structure. And at the top of that, in the British and French Caribbean territories, was the massive colonial structure, exploiting the masses of the people, reaping wealth, taking that wealth outside of the country to the so-called mother country to benefit the Europeans. So you had this complex system of parasitism that I'm sure you know about. When we move to the United States, or even if we look at South America, we have that broad pattern obtaining. If we look at Brazil, we can see the same pattern there. And we quite often forget Brazil. But in fact, Brazil is the largest African nation outside of Nigeria. You know? There are tens and tens of millions of black people down there. There might be complications about the way in which they perceive themselves, but essentially they come from a similar historical experience, same ancestral background, have their roots in Africa, and they also suffered the travails of the New World and slavery in the New World. So we have to remember that and try and educate ourselves. If we are truly Pan-Africanists, we have to educate ourselves about all Africans, especially a group as large as that in Brazil today. In the United States, we had a prolonged period of slavery right up to 1865, the end of the Civil War. And then you had what the boys call this brief moment of being allowed to stand in the sunshine and then being pushed back into the shadows. That is the moment of Reconstruction, when black people in the South, various parts of the South, were given the constitutional right, and indeed struggle for that constitutional right to vote, to gain education, to own property, to protect their property, and so on. In practice, there are always ruffians and vagabonds that deprive people of their rights. But constitutionally, they actually gained those rights in the Reconstruction legislation that passed in the aftermath of the Civil War. It wasn't that the Republicans were just nice to black people. It was really very much related to self-interest and the way in which they played politics against the Democratic Party and how they tried to win power within the Congress and so on. It's a very complex process of realpolitik in the most wicked form. When they had actually had their pound of flesh from black people, then they abandoned them to the tender mercies of the Confederacy. And what happened in the late 1870s, right into the 19th century, was an astonishing level of lynching, disenfranchisement, systematic humiliation of black people, and the passing of a whole number of measures that indicated quite clearly that black people had no rights in the United States. Yeah? There are no rights, as the Dred Scott decision pointed out. There are no rights that a black man has that a white man had to respect. And then in 1896, you had Plessy versus Ferguson that actually said separate but equal is okay. It's a very funny formulation, that, and sometimes people don't examine it. It says separate but equal. But in fact, it was always unequal. It was separate, but it was always unequal. And it makes us wonder what the prospects of black people would have been in this country had it actually been separate and equal. What would it have been like had black people gained access to the same type of education? What would it have been like had they gained access to the same type of work? What would it have been like had they had the same type of transportation? By definition, they would have to put on the same type of trains, the same quality of trains, rather than putting people next to the engine, getting all the smoke over their clothes and next to the cattle and stuff like that they carried. It was a con. It was never separate but equal. It was separate and unequal. It was a humiliation, and it was meant to be a humiliation. And black people were systematically stripped of their rights to vote in the southern states during the late 19th century and in the early part of the 20th century. There's something else that was taking place that was very, very important at this point in time. This was the spread in a most systematic and expansive way of racist ideology. They call it scientific racism, but really it wasn't scientific at all. Some people call it pseudo-scientific racism. I don't know why they use science at all, because it had no basis in fact. And basically what you had were a group of men, in many cases without any integrity whatsoever, making up texts to prove, in their view, that Africans were inferior, that black people were inferior to white people in every way, and most of all in their capacities as human beings, especially the capacity of their minds. They were inferior, they said. And the vast majority of white people at the time believed that. And unfortunately, many black people fell under that spell too. They actually imbibed, and it's difficult not to imbibe you when you're not given any alternative. Sheikh Anta Diop wasn't writing at that time. You couldn't read his books. Insofar as you got any information about Africa, barring a minuscule amount of people with integrity who wrote about Africa at the time, insofar as you read a book on Africa, this nonsense, this crap would be shoved down your throat. And therefore, it's not surprising that our people became confused. It's not surprising that we ourselves began to doubt our very capacities. We had to struggle against that doubt. We had to struggle against it on the basis of faith rather than so-called science, because they said all of the science was on the side of the white man. How could we use it? But even then, there were intellectuals, bright black men and women among our people around the world, in Haiti, in Jamaica, here in the United States, some who lived in Europe, in various parts of Europe, in France in particular, people from Africa. They actually tried to gain as much information as they could, information that was untarnished about Africans, tried to analyze it, tried to make sense of our condition. In many ways, they were trying to say that we are human. And it's a terrible burden to put on a people to prove that they are humans. Can you imagine how much of a waste of time that was? They could be doing other things. You know, I often think of the boys spending all his time writing all these books about black people, defending black people, and it was only necessary because of what was there. It was a ideology. It was a counter discourse. Because you had this mountain, this Everest of European lies, European malignment of black people that had been developing for centuries and centuries, directly connected to their predations on Africa, to the exploitation of Africa, to the capturing of Africans and selling them across the Atlantic as slaves. It was necessary in that exercise to build that mountain in order to explain to themselves what they were doing and justify to themselves what they were doing. It was all right to send them across there. It's okay to pack them like sardines and send them across because they're not like us, you know, they're not humans. So that was the world in which we lived. That was the world in which black people lived at the time that Garvey was around, in the late 19th century when Garvey was growing up. Garvey was only 13 in 1900. He was born in 1887. So that was his world. And basically, if you looked at the map in its entirety, the entire planet, despite the fact that Europeans constitute only a tiny minority of the world's population, the entire planet was effectively under their control. Even China, large and populous, was effectively under British control by the end of the 19th century. Japan managed to maintain some integrity. Japan was one of the few nations that saw the dangers of the rise of the Europeans and these people coming in their boats looking very different from themselves and saying that they want to trade. The Japanese weren't very keen on that. And in fact, they had to use gunboats in order to get into the Japanese market, Commodore Perry in the 1860s. But the Japanese were very clever. The ruling class was highly organized. They actually said to themselves, well, these people have a high level of technology. Look at their guns. Look at these guns that they have. You know, the Japanese weren't interested in rifles in the beginning because they thought it was just unfair to fight with someone when you're so far away from them, you know, to hurt someone. You know, the samurais thought that it was unmanly to use a firearm. You have to survive and show your prowess by the way in which you wielded your sword, by the way in which you approach someone eye to eye and show your dexterity and skill. The Europeans, of course, have long given up that type of manliness. They would actually shoot you without seeing you. And they had been doing it, of course, on one another for centuries. So this whole business of practicing these things had been going on in Europe, and then they carried it abroad. But it was very strange to non-European cultures. Many Africans, the Zulus were amazed by it. They just thought, you know, it was, why would they use such things? Why don't they come at us and face us like decent people and fight us if they want to fight? But anyway, what happened, however, is that the Japanese learned that they had to use the firearms if they were going to survive. And they learned that they had to acquire the technology that these people had in order to compete with them. And so they sent out their young men, maybe a few women, but mainly men at the time, I'm afraid, to Europe, to the United States and elsewhere to acquire their education and develop their technology. What's interesting about the Japanese, however, is that they maintained their cultural integrity. I actually had the privilege of going to Japan a couple of years ago, just over a year ago, and I was astonished. The actual society, despite its technological base and sophistication, is profoundly non-European. Amazing. Even walking down the steps in the buildings, I had to walk sideways because they made their steps for small Japanese feet. They didn't make it for Europeans or Africans, they made it for themselves.
Yeah? How many black societies in the Caribbean or in Africa that is shaped for the benefit of their inhabitants? In the Caribbean, I've just come from a conference in Antigua, and the whole society is organized around tourism. It's organized around the Europeans, you know. The locals are there to serve the Europeans, the visitors. Now in Japan, the visitors come, but they are in the Japanese's house. Yeah? Right? And it's a big, big difference. And that was why intelligent black men and women in the 19th century, such as Hubert Harrison, such as Marcus Garvey, were very interested in the Japanese. They were very interested in the Japanese. And then in 1905, the Japanese defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. And black people in the United States were amazed. And they were delighted. And they were delighted because the Japanese were regarded by the Europeans as inferior too. You know, it's only recently that the Europeans stopped laughing at the Japanese, including their cars. You know, it's relatively, it's not long ago. Even in the early 70s, people laughed at Japanese cars. You know, now they all beg the Japanese to come and invest in their countries. And so, with the rise of the strength of Japan, you had a change in the perception of the Japanese and indeed the degree of respect that Europeans pay Japanese people. Even the South Africans had to make a special category for them, honorary white, you know. Prior to that, of course, Chinese and Asian people were treated like dirt, just like here in the United States, in California and stuff like that. Yeah? But with the rise of Japan as a major power, you had growing respect. And so, in fact, in this country, among Afro-Americans, there was an astonishing degree of respect and curiosity about Japan. So Japan was the only place, effectively, that had some semblance, non-European country, that had some serious semblance of independence in the world. In Arabia, all of those places were under different protectorates. The British had gone into the Indian subcontinent from the 19th century and dominated it. They started in the 18th century, but by the end of the 19th century, they more or less finished their work. Singapore was an entrepot for England. Hong Kong, we all know about. And you go right around, even in Latin America, where they're supposed to be independent, they were under largely British tutelage because of British investment, British railways and stuff like that invested in those countries. And many of the ruling class in those societies, in any case, were Europeans or certainly regarded themselves as such. So then, the world in which Garvey entered was a world dominated by Europe. A world in which Africans were systematically maligned, a world in which non-Europeans were regarded as inferior, and even so-called educated people took it for granted that non-Europeans were inferior to them. In the United States, lynching basically was in many ways a pastime for white folks in the South. But we should also remember there's a dynamic to lynching that black people quite often forget. And the dynamic to lynching that we are quite often forgetful of is that it wasn't as random as some people think it was. Lynching, the way in which it operated, was the systematic beheading of the black population in this society. Why do I say that? They lynched those who had property. They lynched so-called uppity Negroes. They lynched the professionals. They lynched those who spoke out. They lynched the brave. They lynched the courageous. And the price of speaking out, the price of getting out of your place was lynching. And so when we look at the history of Afro-America, we should not simply look at who exists at any particular point in time, but who had departed, who had been taken out prematurely out of this world. And you'll find, when you look at those who were lynched, you find that they were the bravest and most courageous sons and daughters of Africa. Sometimes foolhardy, but they were courageous. People were, you know, someone wants your property and he just tell you to leave or you're going to be lynched. Anyway, you have to remember that though. So that's the situation. We know about Garvey's travels, so I won't talk a great deal about that. Go ahead. All right, I like that. I won't take too much advantage of it. Garvey traveled in Europe, and he traveled in Costa Rica and Honduras and various parts of Central America, in Panama. In fact, in Costa Rica and Panama, he actually edited 2 different newspapers. He traveled to England and he traveled on the continent while he was based in England. In Central America, he was able to observe the conditions under which black people operated, especially on the banana plantations that were there, the Panama Canal. And in Europe, when he went to Europe, he saw the way in which black people were systematically discriminated against, difficulty in getting into hotels, lodgings of various kinds you can't get, etc., etc. He also, however, met Africans in the widest sense of the term, people from different parts of the Caribbean, as well as from people from Africa, the continent itself. In Central America, in his travels, he would have met up with various groups of Africans too, from different parts of the Caribbean, and some indeed from the mainland itself. So he actually managed to develop a consciousness of his common identity with these people. He developed a consciousness beyond a narrow, a parochial Jamaican consciousness, and became an internationalist, a Pan-Africanist. He realized that the condition of black people, wherever he traveled, was fundamentally the same. And it was around this time that he met Deuce Muhammad Ali at the African and Orient Review in London, and his first article, in fact, was published in that newspaper, and he worked with him around that newspaper. It was a magazine that was concerned with African history, ancient African history, as well as contemporary developments, looking at what was happening in the East in general, the non-European world, fundamentally. They talked a great deal. They corresponded with various people in the United States and in Africa and elsewhere. And so there was a sense in which you had the development of an intellectual community in that group that actually helped tremendously to develop this wider Pan-African consciousness. That was there before. It had always been there. It was there in the 19th century. And it was there among the intellectuals too, with people like Blyden, Cromwell, and various other people. But now, with the massive migration of people from different parts of the black world, there was great opportunity to bring genuine coherence to this ideology of Pan-Africanism. By the time you reach the First World War, with all these African soldiers, millions of Africans being pulled into the war, with all these Caribbean soldiers from the French Caribbean, from the British Caribbean being pulled into the maelstrom of the European war, with 200,000 Afro-Americans serving in Europe during the First World War. You have this opportunity of seeing a wider world and coming together to develop an identity of perspective among black people. And they developed this identity of perspective because they were essentially treated the same. Yeah? So that was the fundamental basis for that. In the United States itself, what the historians call the Great Migration, the exodus from the south to the north, also created remarkably dynamic urban communities in the northern United States for the first time on a massive scale. Harlem, Chicago, Black Pittsburgh, Philadelphia was reinforced by the Great Migration. Whole number of places came into being as black communities during the period of the First World War. And it came into existence because European migration had been cut off. Well over 1 million Europeans used to come to the United States each year. But in 1918, there was only 111,000. Yeah? I say so too. All right. And therefore, you needed the labor power. And, of course, when they had the white Europeans, they didn't turn to Africans. Now that they needed it, they went down south with recruiters, labor recruiters, and gave them free passage to Chicago, etc., to Philadelphia, to Pittsburgh, to work in the steel mills, and so on. And so you had the creation of these new urban communities. And in these urban communities, you have people from different states meeting together for the first time. In a place like Harlem, you had people from virtually every state living in this community. And they actually got to have a sense of each other, know about their custom, where they came from, how their lives were, what sort of music they liked, what sort of food they ate. And the cuisines vary, as we all know. And then you have these people from the Caribbean. You have some French speaking, you have some English speaking, then you have people from Curacao, you have people speaking Papiamento, you have people speaking Dutch. And in Harlem, this great crucible, you had these different groups coming together. It wasn't always harmonious, as you no doubt know. But nevertheless, there's a sense of community, a sense of solidarity that developed in these communities that actually meant that black people could organize themselves in a systematic way for the first time. The other thing about the North is that despite its constraints, it provided a great degree of freedom for black people to operate. They could actually publish newspapers here without being lynched on a daily basis. In Atlanta, you know, if you publish a newspaper and it's critical of the local status quo, then you have to leave town. Newspapers are closed down, the editor runs for his life, houses burned down, and so on. And those are real differences that existed between the North and the South. And so that environment provided the material infrastructure for the creation of this new political movement. You also had the return of hundreds of thousands of veterans from the First World War, not just the ones from the United States, but also quite a few thousand from the Caribbean coming to the United States after the First World War. And many of them came to the United States and came to Harlem precisely because that was where the UNIA was located. So they actually came for very political reasons. And so you had the development of that type of political consciousness emerging. I'm trying to look for my handkerchief. I don't know what I've done with it. There's another very important thing, and then I'll get on to the fundamental legacies of Garvey. But we need to understand the circumstances before we can understand the real magnitude of the man's achievement and contribution. We need to see the darkness of the times in which they lived in order to understand the beacon that he brought to those conditions. Another very important thing about that conjuncture, which applied to black people around the world, was the way in which the European powers, especially those fighting against Germany, said that they were fighting to make the world safe for democracy. President Wilson said that, with a straight face in April 1917 when they were about to send troops over. We're making the world safe for democracy, the man said. Black people couldn't vote in the South, black people couldn't vote in many places in the United States, but yet the United States was making the world safe for democracy. Now, the way they square that circle, of course, is that black people are not really human beings at all, That's the way you get around that contradiction. We don't really count, yeah? So you have that. Black people heard that, making the world safe for democracy. And they thought, how about Alabama, How about having a little bit of democracy down there? And what you find in any case is that many of the people, the driving force, and we have to remember this, if we are to honor our ancestors, we should be able to pinpoint the particularly distinguished and courageous ones that we should honor. Should honor all of them, but we should pay particular attention to those who made great sacrifices, so that we can do certain things today that we can take for granted that they couldn't. A key group in the transformation of the political culture of the United States and Afro-American politics in general were the veterans from the First World War. And the veterans, even now, every single war, the veterans actually play a very, very important role. In the aftermath of the Civil War, they played a key role in trying to defend black people in different parts of the United States. When they came back from the First World War, they were particularly well mobilized and well organized and dedicated to defense of Afro-America. In 1917, you had the East St. Louis Pogrom. I was going to read something about that, but I won't now. It was just a terrible massacre, basically, of black people in July in 1917 in East St. Louis. The white folks just went on the rampage in the black area. And what they did, it was really barbaric. It was really shocking, even for America. What they did, for instance, is to actually board people up in their houses before they actually set them on fire, block the windows, block the doors, and so on. And what you find too, they would throw, torches into the houses to set them on fire, and then they would wait outside with their guns and shoot whoever ran out. And then they just burned the area. It was just amazing. And we should really study more about East St. Louis and pay homage to the memory of East St. Louis because it was so horrible and so important. And that event helped to radicalize black people who had never considered themselves ready to be radicalized. And that was a key thing, and Garvey made one of his most moving speeches ever made. He came to the United States in 1916, and East St. Louis happened within a year of his arrival, or just after a year of his arrival. And he made this wonderful speech, and they published it as a pamphlet, and it was an amazing thing. And that document and that speech that he made in Harlem actually rallied a whole number of people to his organization. But in 1918, the veterans returned. In 1919, you had an attempted rampage again by white thugs and mobs in various parts of the United States. And the veterans were ready. And they actually fought back tremendously. In Washington, D.C., they actually took the fight into the white areas for the first time. They actually mounted machine guns on cars and drove into the white areas and actually strafed them, just as they had done in their area. It was a remarkable thing. There was never an inquiry into it, and I think it was partly because they didn't want black people to know how well they had done in Washington, D.C. They did extremely well in Chicago as well, and the black casualties were only higher in Chicago than the white ones because of the intervention of the police on the side of the mobs. But black folks organized themselves. The veterans went into buildings, set up machine gun turrets, and shoot them as they came down. They were fighting back, and that's where Claude McKay's poem comes from. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, right? That is where it comes from. That is the context, a context in which black people were fighting back. It wasn't going to be another East St. Louis. Yeah? They were going to take an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life. And that was what was happening. And so what you find then is that Garvey is here in this context. Yeah? Garvey is here in this context, and he had, by this time, developed this astonishing ability to move people and to actually link up with their aspirations and desires, their fears, their suffering in a remarkable way. And he built up this astonishing movement. It became so large so quickly because of those things that I told you about. It wasn't simply to do with the greatness of Garvey. That was there too, that was very important. But in order to understand these millions of people around the globe, Garvey himself was surprised by it. You know, when he wrote about these things in the 1930s, when he was in London, he says it perhaps got too big or so. You know, it was, when you think about it, it's just astonishing. Up to now, there's never been an organization with the type of ambition, the type of outlook, the type of scale that the UNIA had in 1920, 1922, up to 1923. And after 1925, when Garvey was indicted, you had the collapse or the slowing down of the organization. So you had this development. Now, why was Garvey so popular? Well, the conjuncture was important. The set of circumstances that I was talking about was important. But on top of that, you actually had Garvey helping to break the spell of European supremacy. Garvey, in my view, in terms of his most important contribution to black people, is actually to tell black people with a straight face and with complete sincerity that there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with you. That's what Garvey said. They're not innately brighter than we are. They're not stronger than we are. We have the capacity to do these things, and indeed we have done these things in the past. Yeah? And we can actually show what happened to us, why we have come to this sorry pass. What Garvey did was to tell black people to love themselves. And if they actually love themselves, if they actually develop the capacity to love themselves, then they'll actually demand better. They won't accept being treated as shit. They'd fight back. And what he did was to develop an organization around, you know, people call it racial consciousness, but it really is about black self-love. That's what it's about, essentially. For black people to realize that there's nothing wrong with them. And what he did was to develop that organization and then develop this program about how to protect ourselves, how to develop our capacities so we cannot be taken advantage of as easily as people have taken advantage of us as a people. And that's why he called for nationhood. He felt that in terms of protecting ourselves, the best thing to do was to establish a nation of our own, where we could actually develop our armies, develop our infrastructure, and we will actually protect ourselves from European predations. Leave us alone if you're not going to give us justice. Just let us go off and set up our nation. That was Garvey's message. And that was why Garveyism was so strong in the south of the United States. You know, the largest chapters were actually, the largest number of chapters were actually in Louisiana, right? They were all, large numbers of chapters were in the south. There were large ones in the north, but in terms of sheer numbers, they were all in these little hamlets in Georgia and places like that. And we need to remember that. And Garvey's message appealed to people in the South, especially because they realized that they wouldn't get the degree of freedom that they expected or they were promised to get in the United States. Garvey's legacy is extremely rich. It's astonishing, and each day I learn more about it. A colleague of mine is bringing out some documents soon, a second set of documents about Garvey's influence on African nationalism. And it's just amazing what was happening, the way in which this man's message reached different parts of Africa, in Namibia, in Guinea-Bissau, even in the French-speaking African countries where people thought that black people didn't have any consciousness and the French stopped them, and etc. There's astonishing levels of influence. In South Africa, the influence was quite profound. What he also did was to help to develop this self-reliance. Garvey actually, in marked contrast to the NAACP, turned money down from white folks. Even well-wishers, well-wishers coming to get money. And he says, no, thank you very much. We will actually develop our base. And one of the most moving documents I have ever seen, and there are several copies of these because it continued quite a bit, were these pages in the Negro World in the 1920s with donations from members and well-wishers. And you'd see Mr. C. Campbell, the Bronx or Brooklyn, 10 cents. Somebody from Louisiana sent 5 cents, from rural Louisiana. There's a group of about 8 people that didn't make up more than 50 cents in their donation, and their individual names were given. And I love that. That was very touching. And that is what you call self-reliance, where you actually depend upon your group, no matter how small the contribution is, but you depend upon yourselves to mobilize resources. And if you do that, you maintain your independence. The Ford Foundation can't tell you what to say. The Rockefeller Foundation can't tell you what to say. Only your own group of people will be able to tell you what to say. And I was very touched this evening by the donation. I'll waive my fee. I couldn't take it. It's a great privilege to be here, and I'm delighted to be here. Use it to buy books or something. Do some other good work with it. I'll be happy to do that. I really couldn't accept that. I'm a child of the African diaspora. I am a Pan-Africanist. I'm concerned about my people's plight. What we could say anyway, in conclusion, is that Garvey contributed greatly in a very direct and material way to the liberation of Africa and the independence of African countries, the independence of the Caribbean nations. Despite their limited achievements after independence, it actually constitutes progress. The changes have made some difference. There's a great deal of work to be done, but the changes that have been achieved are worthwhile, and they're things that actually came from hard struggle. So that's the fundamental legacy of this man. He worked extremely hard. He perhaps lived about 4 or 5 lifetimes in one life. He died when he was 53, never seemed to have slept. Everybody was amazed about where he got the energy from. And he was fired by all the evidence that I can see, and I've read all the intelligence reports and all the documents and so on, that talk about the Black Star Line and so forth. But the money didn't go to Garvey's pocket. There are all sorts of things that happen, but it wasn't for self-aggrandizement or self-enrichment. It was a selfless effort on his part in a most remarkable way that is really unprecedented. And because Garvey loved us so, and because he struggled so hard, we should always remember him and try in our own way to build upon his achievements. But anyway, thanks. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks very much. Sorry for keeping you so long. All right.
Thank you. Let us put our hands together one more time for Dr. Professor Winston James. He's the author of Holding Aloft the Banner of Ethiopia. There's some books on sale in the back, and I'm sure that he would be glad to autograph them for you. On your way out, we also do need you to stop and certainly buy your copy of Blueprint for Black Power, the new book just released by Dr. Amos Wilson. Can we all stand and hold the hand of the brother or sister next to you? Next Wednesday night, Dr. Khalid Muhammad will be here, right from Gambia, where he is today as we speak. And we open up the fall, September being our new year, so to speak, with a tribute to Dr. John Henry Clark, followed by a tribute to Dr. Ben in September, and then speakers galore for weeks to come. This Saturday is the first rehearsal for the UAM Flag Corps in preparation for our glorious march in the African American Day Parade in September. We're asking all of you brothers and sisters and your children to join us as we each carry a flag, a proud display of who we are in the African American Day Parade. There are no special requirements. The only requirement is that you be there this Saturday for rehearsal at 10 a.m. at Boys and Girls High in Brooklyn. Yes, as we move towards our affirmation, this is at 10 a.m. on Saturday, Boys and Girls High. The only qualification is that you be there and you look like us. Y'all know that already. I'd like to close as we close in our affirmation, but I'd like to just read a few words from the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey. This was his first message to the Negro of the world from the Atlanta prison in 1925. My work has just begun, and when the history of my suffering is complete, then future generations of Negroes will have in their hands the guide by which they shall know the sins of the 20th century. I, and I know you too, believe in time, and we shall wait patiently for 200 years, if need be, to face our enemies through our posterity. After my enemies are satisfied in life or death, that's what I love here, I shall come back to you to serve even as I have served before. In life I shall be the same. In death I shall be a terror to the foes of Negro liberty. If death has power, then count on me in death to be the real Marcus Garvey I would like to be. This is real, because this is what's happening now. If I may come in an earthquake, or a cyclone, or plague, or pestilence, or as God would have me, then be assured that I shall never desert you and make your enemies triumph over you. If I die in Atlanta, my work shall then only begin. All right.